Welcome to POWTS Chat for June of 2025. Today's POWTS Chat is going to be divided into two sections. In the first section, Matt Jansen is going to be introducing a new soil series that we're going to be doing here on POWTS Chat and then speaking about the driftless area. In the second portion of POWTS Chat, I will be speaking on variances. Thank you. Hope you enjoy.
What we're going to talk about today is we did have previously some segments. We had talked about different soil orders, and we had looked at different soil types, soil series that were representative of each of the soil
Yes.
orders, getting some of that
It all
classification
fits.
and information in there. So what we're going to talk about now is we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to talk about some Wisconsin landforms. So throughout the state, there are several different landforms that may affect septic systems and are sort of grouped. Um, so there are some of these that we're going to be looking at over the next upcoming months. Now, granted, each of these, I mean, there are hundreds, if not thousand, different kinds of soil series in these geographical areas. So obviously we can't focus on every single soul series, and just like anything, there's a lots of different variation, but in each of these different landform groups we're going to see similar things that are going to continue to pop up, and so we're going to try to focus on some of those similarities that of likely things that we may see in some areas. So some of them that we're going to look at again in the upcoming months is the driftless area, the southwest part of the state. That's actually going to be the one that we're going to talk about later today. So I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail with any of these, but this one we will talk about more. Um, we're also going to look at the Kettle Moraine drumlin fields. That will be an upcoming one. Southeast part of the state, edge of the glacier, where it did some interesting things. Sort of a unique geographical area or landform for part of the state. With the drumlin fields, we've probably discussed some of that before, and again the Marines. Northern Highlands is sort of a group of area that have some similar soils. So that will be one area that we're going to take a look at. And then we're also going to look at the Niagara Escarpment. So that's a feature. The Niagara Escarpment is the same one that wraps around to Niagara Falls out in New York, but it has some unique geology and landform presents us, and some challenges presented through the mostly Door County and through sort of that um, eastern, I guess, the finger of the state of Wisconsin over there. And then we also have Great Lakes clay basins. There's the Superior Clay Basin and then the Lake Michigan Clay Basin, have some unique soils that are associated with those. And then the last one that we're going to talk about will be the Glacial Lake Wisconsin Basin, the central sands and the glacial lake that used to be there, and what some of those features are. So those are some of the upcoming ones that we're going to talk about with the landforms. These are going to be sort of our next topics for the next couple months. Sort of give you a little bit, drill down a little bit more in depth, um, and give you some characteristics of what some of these areas are, and then tie them in um, with what's happening. So again, as I mentioned, the first one that we plan on talking about is what we call the driftless area, which is in the southwest part of the state. And this is as best as I could trace, the extent of it. Don't beat me up too much if you know the county really well, where that exact area is. Sort of interfingers back and forth in there a little bit in some of the valleys, depending on what else has gone on. So why is it called driftless? So you may have heard this term, driftless, especially if you're in the area, and if you're in other parts of the state, you may have heard this. But why is it called driftless? So the driftless region, it refers to the lack of recent glacial drift. So drift is a term for any of the materials that a glacier has brought down. So whether it's a glacial till or a glacial outwash, so any of those materials that come out of a glacier, this area did not receive any during the last four ice events during the Pleistocene. So that would be the Wisconsin, Illinois, Kansas, and Nebraska glacial periods. So Nebraska was older. We're talking probably a million years ago. Kansas maybe 700,000. Illinois 150,000. Wisconsin ended maybe 10 to 15,000 years ago. So it didn't receive any, and there's been some talk about why this is that we think that some of the uplands that are there, the highlands in the UP and northern Wisconsin sort of routed the fingers of the glacier. That's why the lakes are shaped that way. So Lake Superior sort of came down from the northeast to the southwest and went around it, and then the Lake Michigan lobe, basically went south, and the Green Bay lobe sort of south and a little bit southwest. But if the glacier would have advanced farther south, it may have eventually closed up around that area, but it did not, and so that driftless area hasn't been affected by any of the most recent glaciations. It's also interesting that the driftless area technically only covers the southwest part of Wisconsin and a small part of northwestern Illinois. Sometimes you'll hear the Minnesota and Iowa parts referred to as driftless. Well, it's sort of hard to see. The map's a little small here, but they were covered by glaciers, but not the most recent ones. They weren't covered by the Wisconsin or the Illinois. They were covered by the Kansas and Nebraska. And since those were so old, we're talking, 700,000 years ago, that even though there is some drift there, it's so old that those areas look like the Wisconsin side of the river. They're very old drift and they've been weathered for a long time and they look very similar. But technically, the driftless area is only in the southwest part of Wisconsin and northwestern Illinois, a little bit northwestern. But they have similar topography, similar soils. And we'll look at that in sort of how that is affected here later on with a couple of soil series that I did call out. So this is what the driftless area looks like. Here's sort of a oblique air photo. But driftless area, it's highly dissected. It's erosional landscape that prevails. Again, since the area has not been glaciated for quite some time. So it's been a long, there were probably glaciers here, but not in the Pleistocene. So we're talking millions of years ago. There may have been some drift, but other stuff has been obliterated or eroded off the landscape. So there's no evidence of any recent glacial drift in this area. So typically you'll see this, you'll have, like I said, dissected landscapes. You'll have the valleys with the streams in it. You'll have the uplands, depending where you are and how wide the uplands are. I know it varies that some areas they farm the uplands, other areas that's too steep. They farm the side slopes. But that's sort of the nature that you get. A lot of contour farming, a lot of steep eroded areas, and then you have the valleys. And like I said, some of them are flip flop depending where you are. Some of the valleys are wooded, other ones, the hills are wooded because they're too steep, depending on the steepness and where they're located. But that's sort of topography in what you see out there in the driftless area. So valleys tend to be dominated by streams with alluvial sediments. So here's sort of a representative photo. What you see, you got the steep hillside, and then you have the valley down on the bottom, alluvial sediments. Sometimes you'll get colluvium from the uplands because stuff is eroding off the hillsides and sort of rolling down the hills, falling down the hills. We'll also get some sites in here that may tend to be some bluffs areas, like you get towards La Crosse, you got like the Grandad Bluffs and some of the coulees. You'll have some areas that do have some exposed rocks and some really interesting cuts as these rivers or creeks go through and cut into that landscape and expose some of the bedrock. You'll get some really interesting landforms and land cuts down there. The uplands tend to be dominated by areas that are shallow to bedrock. Now you can't see the key very much, but in the southwest part of the state, so this pale yellow and the pale green, and the real light yellow is bedrock within 5 feet of surface, 35 to 70%. The pale green is greater than 70% is shallow to bedrock within 5 feet of the surface. So the browns farther north, those are areas that are like 50 or 100 feet to bedrock, or 100 feet or more in the real dark ones. So a lot of the rest of the state and why it's deeper to bedrock is because, a lot of those areas have been covered by drift. They've got glacial outwash or other deposits that are there covering it. Where in the southwest part of the state, we don't have that because it wasn't glaciated. We don't have those glacial deposits, and therefore we have some shallow bedrock issues over there. So what does some of that bedrock look like? Here's just one cut. I mean, again, it varies depending on where you are in the driftless. Again, we're trying to generalize, thousands and thousands of acres, hundreds of thousands of acres. But the area is, comprised of a bunch of different of sedimentary um, rocks and formations out there. That's predominantly what the base is over there. So some of those that you run into quite a bit are the Galena group of dolomite. St. Peter sandstone is another common one that we run into. And there's other ones like Platteville limestone, Prairie du Chien formations. There's a few other formations that we don't always see in here. We've got another one coming up that we'll talk about. That's the base rock for one of the soil series that we're looking at. That's not listed on here, but we'll have various different formations, but they all are sedimentary. So we'll get a lot of limestone or dolestone, dolomite, sandstone outcrops, and you'll see that if you've driven down to like the Platteville area and the 151 road cuts, you can see all that exposed bedrock down there, and there's been some historical significance to these. They've been mined for lead. You get down in the Grant, Lafayette, and Iowa counties, a lot of lead mines down there. Um, even into the 40s, there were still several hundred mines that were still active. Um, and that's where the Badgers came from. The original lead miners were digging in the hills, and they said they looked like badgers. That's where the Badger State moniker comes from. Also, we have some frac sand farther north. We have some deposits where some of that frac sand is getting into some of these deposits, and then just natural building materials. People are taking out some of those limestones or dole stones for building blocks, building materials. And you'll see some of the areas, especially southwest part of the state, the older buildings, like if you get down like the Mineral Point area, and in Pendarvis, the state historical area down there. A lot of those old homes, they were built out of that limestone or more of the dole stone kind of things. So it is significant in that respect, from the building materials, but it also imparts specific soil types to us in that driftless area. This is what we're typically seeing down there. So the two series that I wanted to look at is the first one is the Norden soil series, which is an upland. Now, if you remember what I had mapped out for the driftless area, you can see the Norden tracks very well with what the driftless area is. It's basically almost like superimposed over that. So I call it a typical. It's just as widespread in that driftless area, but again, there's thousands of acres, hundreds of soil series, but this is one that's widespread in the driftless area, so that's why I picked it. So this one is a typic haplodolph. So if you remember from our previous classifications, it ends in ALF, so it's an alpha sol. So it's a forested soil. Typically, we see a moderate topsoil, and then we have usually like a BT horizon, some kind of clay accumulation. That's typical of it, and then it's a loamy soil on dissected upland. So that's the Norden soil series. If you're wondering what the red dots are, that just shows where they've taken some representative samples of what they call the typical Norden series. Is where they mapped it. The interesting thing is, for those of you that have been going to the 2-day soils training, you may have remembered that I had that one bucket of the strange soil, the glauconitic sandstone. Well, this is where one of the places it comes from is the Norden soil series. So many of the sites are steep. There's even reports of Norden soil series being up to 60%. Super steep, but many sites are fairly steep. 20 to 30% isn't uncommon for Norden. It has a lust cap, so a silty lust cap on top of glauconitic sandstone residuum. So it's that does have some lust from that has been blown in on top of that, but it's not drift, it's not till or outwash, but the lust cap isn't considered glacial drift. But the wind blown silt, the lust cap is there, and then we have residuum underneath. And this is residuum of the Tunnel City Formation, which is the glauconitic sandstone. And then we have a second parent material of loamy sand is what we see, and that's derived from the loamy is sort of that silt that's washing down through there, the BT kind of thing accumulation, and then we have the sand from the sandstone underneath. And the Northern series can vary widely depending on how eroded it is, to what its contact is with the stone, and that's going to depend on what your separation distance is. So it can vary. But here's a typical profile of Norden. If you're looking at the numbers on the profile, those are actually in centimeters, so that's why it says 0 to 20, but that's actually in centimeters. So it's about 0 to 8 inches. An AP horizon, 10YR33, 2M SBK, which is a little unusual to have angular or subangular blocky as a topsoil, but that's what they call it as the profile. Silt loam, 8 to 11, they have the BT1. So we talked about the clay accumulation. It's a typical, you know, alpha sol. So we have a BT accumulation 4, 2 MSBK silt loam, 11 to 20, BT2, 5, 4, 2M SBK silt loam, 20 to 25. Now you see it says 2 BT3. So we have that second parent material coming in. And also look what happened then to the color. It went from 10YR, sort of that lust cap, to now we have that glauconitic sandstone is giving us some really strange colors, 5Y53, 2M SBK loam. So now we're switching, we're getting away from the silt and we're getting more of the sand, and now it's a loam. And then 25 to 37, I lumped the 4 and the 5 together. But 2BT4, 5G41, real dark but green. And that's that glauconitic sandstone. And now we're at fine sandy loam. We're getting more of that sand content from the sandstone. And then the typical profile at 37 inches is rock, sea horizon rock. And then it's 5G41, which is the color of the parent material. That's why the horizon below above it, defined sandy loam, is the same color, and it's weakly cemented sandstone. And where that contact is, it can vary. So as you can see here, if we're having contact at 37 inches, we're sort of on the border of having some different septic systems. If it's shallower than 36, we're looking at a mound. If we're more than 36, we can probably get an at grade on the site. So what are some of the site challenges that we deal with on this is obviously we have the shallow bedrock. So not getting conventionals on these sites, is very unlikely to get a conventional. Um, typically a lot of the driftless area we're 3 to 5 feet to bedrock. So we have a shallow bedrock, steep slopes to worry about. So even if you do want to put a mound on the site, the problems that we have with that is if you're on a steep site that's 20 or 25%, even though it meets the component manual, the problem is that K dimension, your downslope toe, is getting away from you, and you have to add so much fill to catch up with that because to get your 3-to-1 slope as the slope is going away from you, you have these real large downslope toes. And really not practical. So, even if the site, you could put a 6-inch mound out there. If you're qualified for an at grade, it's better to do that because you don't have these long downslope toes or K dimensions. And then sometimes you run into limited contour length, is that you don't have these long slopes. It's very dissected, so they're cutting back on themselves. And sometimes it's hard to find a length of slope that extends for an amount. So you may have to stack cells on top of each other or chevron kind of thing, one slope facing one direction and then another half of the cell facing a different direction. So those are some of the site challenges that you encounter with these upland steep soils. So the other soils I wanted to point out would be like a valley soil series. So one that we're going to look at here is Orensville. Um, and so this, again, a quotes a typical series for driftless valleys. Now, the interesting thing on this one is you see that this one does not track. It's still in the driftless, but what do we also notice is that we do see some distribution on the west side of the river, which is the Iowa and Minnesota side. And even though that I mentioned that is not quote drift officially driftless, it has driftless-like characteristics. And so the interesting thing is now that we compare that mapping with what it's classified as, it's classified as a typic eudifluvent. So the ENT, if you remember, that means entasol. So that's a recently deposited soil. So you have to remember that the true driftless hasn't seen glaciation in, 700,000 or a million years or more. That was the time of the last glaciation over there, the oldest one, the Nebraskan. But the Iowa and Minnesota side did see those back maybe the 700,000 Kansan or the million Nebraskan, but it hasn't seen it for several 100,000 years. So again, entosols are recent, so those soils have been recently formed on the older glacial or between the older glacial deposits in there. And so that's why you see some of those tracking on the west side, the Minnesota and the Iowa side. But there are silty alluvial soils in valleys, is what Orensville is. So they're mostly level sites. This is sort of a typical photo of what you'd see. They're mostly level sites, sort of down in the valley bottoms. The one that I looked at is an occasionally flooded subtype. So that's occasionally flooded terraces, toe slopes, and drainage ways. So you can see here if if the stream gets flooded, comes up over its bank into that cornfield, it's relatively flat in there, but it can expand wider into that valley, and so it may occasionally flood. But typically, a lot of these valley soils that you're going to see are stratified, silty, alluvial material. So here's what a typical profile looks like. Again, the numbers on the picture are in centimeters. But typical profile, you see there's a lot more stuff going on here. So 0 to 10, you have the A horizon 10YR 42, but it also has 10YR 54 and 10YR 32 strata in it. Um, it's from that alluvial as the deposits come through every time there's a flood or a big rainstorm. Maybe that Norden up on top of the hill gets washed down into this valley and gets deposited. So it's listed as a 1 mgr silt loam, so a weak medium granular structure. 10 to 26, it's we have a C horizon already. So remember, that's a parent material. So it's a 10YR 53 with 10YR 42 and 10YR 32 strata, and it's massive silt loam. So it's just a depositional material laid in there. You'll see it in sort of layers or strata, but it's showing that it's massive. It's laid in there. It's compacted, massive. It hasn't been worked on or it hasn't developed much. Remember, these are entosols. These are newer soils, haven't had developmental time to develop more horizonation or other pedogenic processes. And then we see 26 to 40, we have an AB. So there was some kind of large event where stuff washed in there. We have a buried A horizon, 10YR21, 1MPL. So it's platy silt loam with 7.5 YR44 iron masses in it. So we've got some redox. We've got massive above. We have platy silt loam in here. It's buried. And so that's the problem with these sometimes these valley soils is you'll have layers. I've seen some that have like the little strata. They go back and forth like an inch or so back and forth between sandy or silty, sandy, silty, depending on what the erosion was going on. And then 40 to 60, we have a C prime, a second C horizon, different parent material. 10YR4, 2, 0 massive silt loam with strata of fine sand, very fine sand, breaking into coarse platy chunks with 5 wire 3-4 iron masses and 2 5Y 5-2 depletions. So getting pretty ugly down there. So the problems in some of the valleys, depending on what they have, the profiles, typical is a very loose term. There is no typical. It varies so much depending on where you are. Some of these lowland soils may have a larger deposition. They may have a little bit more horizonation with them, but yeah, the typical valley soils are going to have a lot of this banding in it, or strata rather, from different depositional events. So some of the site challenges with them, on these stream terrace slopes, and depending on how close you are to the stream or more upslope and toe slopes you are, shallow depths of water we have problems with, stratified, massive, and platy soils. So there's a lot of difficulty with them, trying to get systems on it because it's really not uniform. It's sort of a mess of what was deposited in there. And then also floodplains, is a lot of these, being in close association with that creek or river in the valley bottom, we have a lot of floodplain issues. So typically we're going to be looking at holding tanks or mounds out there. So just as a summary to summarize, what's the difference between upland and valleys in the driftless. Uplands parent materials are usually a loss over residuum kind of thing. They're steep. We have a limitation usually of the bedrock. That residuum is whatever depth we are to whatever that residual soil is, whether it's a sandstone or limestone or dolomite. And then typically we're looking at grades seems to be the majority of the system types we see there. At grades mounds. And then in the valley, what we're looking at as parent material is alluvial. So we have that washed in material. And then site position is typically flat or relatively flat or only a couple percent slope. Limitation seems to be a water for us. And then the pouts that we typically see would be mounds and holding tanks. So anyway, that's just sort of a breeze through at what the driftless area looks like, some of the soils that we encounter down there, and what some of the site conditions are that we have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matt. Can't wait to hear about the rest of the regions as we go throughout the year. Hopefully everyone can see my screen here. So for the remainder of the presentation today, I'm going to be talking about variances. Why now? It always seems to me like in May and June, I get a lot of questions about variances. Maybe it's because there's a lot of property transfers going on or new building permits being submitted and people find out that they have things that are not exactly code compliant out there. But for whatever reason, I get a lot of questions about variances this time of year. And so I thought it would be an appropriate time to talk about variances. So variances, what are they? What do we do when we can't meet the code? Specifically today, I'm going to be talking about the SPS code and specifically 383, most specifically. If you have questions about the NR codes, so the well codes and things like that, please contact the DNR. I know there's been a bit of discussion very recently about well setbacks and things like that, but we're not going to cover that today. The topic of the presentation is variances as they go with the SPS codes. So just some brief statistics about variances for POWTS in Wisconsin. So variances are extraordinarily rare. In 2023, there were 49 of them approved. In 2024, 31. And so far in 2025, about 15. So when you compare that to the 10 to 11,000 sanitary permits issued every year, or the close to 800,000 existing POWTS that are out there, you can see the variances are very rare. So we talk about them a lot, but an actual approval of a variance is not a common occurrence. But it's still important to talk about them because it is a procedure and a policy that is possible. Just so people are aware, almost all, 99% of POWTS variances are to the horizontal setback table. So our setbacks. There are a few, anything in the code can be petitioned, but that is what typically we see variances for. When we look at a variance application, we have a lot of concerns, and I'll go through them. I'll go through the application, what is required in the code, but if you have something that you consider to be precedent setting, so let's just for the sake of exaggeration say that you're proposing a mound that is 1 foot from the lake, we're going to be very concerned about precedent setting. So if you're going to push the envelope with your variance application, we really would require additional significant proof of long-term viability. There are some variances that have been proven to be equivalent over time, but if you're going to be precedent setting, just keep that in mind, that if you're asking for a lot, you must provide a lot in your application. So just as a reminder, do we even need a variance? So this is a question that comes up sometimes, especially when it comes to the horizontal setback table. So we're going to take a look at some diagrams here that show where the setbacks are measured to see if we even need a variance. So when we're measuring to a building, and this comes up a lot, especially with deck posts, we're going to measure to the foundation or the footing of that. So you can see there that 5-foot setback to the septic tank is measured to the footing of that deck, not to the edge of the construction of it. It's where it meets with the ground. So sometimes we see that where people are requesting, possibly petitioning for something that they don't need to petition for. So we want to measure our setbacks to the correct places. So on the, to the distribution cell, we're measuring 10 feet to the building, not counting window overhangs, not counting roof overhangs, anything like that. We're measuring to where they meet in the ground. And on mounds, we're measuring to basically the basal area or the distribution cell there. We're not measuring to the upslope toe or the side slope toe or anything like that when it comes to the SPS codes. So the setbacks that are not well setbacks. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about petitions for variance. Like, do we even need a petition? Do we actually meet the setback table. Just keep that in mind. So when we talk about variances, we have to reference a code that we don't often look at, and that is Chapter 303 of the Wisconsin Administrative Code, and that is a code that is specific for variances. So Chapter 303 outlines the purpose and the procedures for variances. The purpose of this entire chapter is to specify the procedures for applying for a variance for a rule administered and enforced by the department, so the DSPS codes. If there's something in a subchapter, so if there's something in 383 that is more restrictive regarding variances, then that restrictive requirement shall govern. And so 383 has a little bit about variances, and so that would also apply aside from what is required in 303. So just as some brief definitions here, we're going to talk about equivalency a lot. Because that is what needs to be demonstrated. And so in 303, there's a definition for equivalency, and it means that the same intent and degree of safety, health, or public welfare as contained in the requirements specified in a rule. So when we petition for variance, we need to provide equivalency. So we're providing the same intent and degree of safety, health, and public welfare as the rule would have. And variance just means a specified alternative or deviation from the rule, so as allowed by code. So in general, variances, the scope of variances, who can apply? Well, any person affected by the rule of the department can petition for a variance from the rule. And that petition for variance shall establish an equivalency when it comes to meeting the intent. So anyone can apply if they are affected by the rule. Typically for POWTS, we're going to see this, by the homeowner, and I'll show you on the application where that is. So there are a lot of things that go along with petitions for variance, and there's a lot of rules, but honestly, 303 is a pretty short chapter, so I thought we would just kind of go through some of the high points of it. So when we are submitting an application for a petition for variance, that application should be on the forms furnished by the department, which I'll show as in the following slides, and it shall be submitted when requesting a variance from the rule, and it should have all of these things within it. So 1, a completed petition for variance form, including a clear and concise written statement of the specific provisions of the rule from which the variance is requested, along with a specific statement of the grounds and of the procedures and materials to be used if the variance is granted. So in your variance application, you have to explain, what you're requesting a variance from and how you're going to achieve it. Additionally, you have to include the fee. In order to submit it in ISLA, you're going to have to pay the fee. For POWTS, it's $300 for a petition for variance. Pretty easy to remember. Additionally, there are a few things that could possibly be included depending on which code you are petitioning. There's a section for a statement from a public, from the Department of Health Services or from a fire chief or something like that. For 383, for the POWTS code, you're going to need documentation on there from the code enforcement official. And a variance cannot be approved without that. So when it's specific for POWTS, are there any additional things that are required? Well, yes. So in 383, in addition to what's in 303, we also have some specific requirements when it comes to petitions for variance for a POWTS. And that basically is that the system cannot be failed. If the system has been determined to be failed, pursuant to 145.24, then a petition for variance cannot be granted. So keep that in mind. There's absolutely no point in petitioning for a failed system. It cannot be approved. 383 requires that it be, a non-failed system. And if it is not failed, then we shall consider the petition for variance. So what does that form look like? What does the petition for variance form look like? Here is a picture of the first 2 pages of it. The 3rd page is just the fee schedule. So I thought, well, we don't need to really look at that. The form name is called the SBD 9890X. It's used by DSPS for petitions. So it's a general document. We're going to go through it for POWTS. So this form has to be filled out and has to be submitted via ISLA along with the fee. So if we take a look at the individual sections here as we zoom in, you can see the first line there is the facility information. So you're going to want to include the name of whatever you call the project, the property address of it, and the site number if you know what it is. So if there's a previously approved plan, you'll have a site number for it. You can include that if you want, the legal description, and the county name. Simple, easy section to fill out, but make sure you fill it out correctly. The second section is the owner information and the designer information section. So here you're going to want to include the owner's name, the company name if you have one, the address of the owner, the contact person if it's different than that person, a daytime phone number if we need to call them. How are we going to reach them? Same with the email, and then the same with the designer. So if an agent of the owner, so let's say the plumber, the designer, the builder, or someone like that is submitting this variance application through ESLA on behalf of the owner, you're going to want to include that information there along with their phone number and email address that they can be contacted, for questions, because oftentimes with variances there are questions because we are deviating from the code. And the next section is plan review status, and if there's a previously reviewed plan. So here you would just select whether or not select the correct one, right? If you're submitting a plan review at the same time, you're going to want to check that box. Sometimes we see that, a new system is going in, it needs a petition, they're going at the same time. And then you're going to want to select, which code is being petitioned. For POWTS, it's private sewage systems. Or if there's a previously reviewed plan or something like that, you'll include that information. That's the administrative stuff. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of the actual application. The spaces on the application are pretty small, so you can either write it on the application or see additional documentation. Either way is fine. What is important is that that a variance is completed and proves it answers the questions, I guess. So question 5, you're going to want to state the code section being petitioned and the specific condition or issue you are requesting to be covered under the petition for variance. So we remember back to 303, this is required. You have to say what you're petitioning. So here's just an example of one that I cooked up. So just a random example that we're going to go through here. So in this made up scenario, we're petitioning 38343-1, the table, the horizontal setback parameters, very, very common variance. And we are petitioning the setback from the building to the exterior subsurface treatment tank. And we're petitioning that 5-foot setback there. And we are saying the specific condition and issue, it's a replacement deck. The support post is located 3.5 feet from an existing septic tank. So with that description in mind, you can visualize what is happening out there. Question 6 is going to ask the reason why compliance with the code cannot be attained without a variance. So you're going to want to explain why you need the variance, why you can't avoid it. Unlike, some land use variances or things at the county level, we don't require that it cannot be attained without a variance, but we want, you need to demonstrate equivalency, and it's good to keep in mind why you need a variance, I guess. So it's just my example here. This is what I would, in my random scenario that I just cooked up. I said the deck will be reconstructed with the maximum span between footings due to the required stair location for safe access, right? So it cannot be done without a variance because of, maybe you wanted to cite a building code there or something. That would be great. The existing deck posts are on blocks on grade. The new post will be direct replacement, so there's that. The existing tank is functional, and it would be a significant cost to remove and relocate. Pretty good explanation there. You just want to explain why it cannot be attained without variance. Now, section 7 is the section that absolutely must be explained. The code requires that we explain how we are providing an equivalent degree of health, safety, and welfare. So this is the section that we're going to talk most about, and the section that when we open up a variance application, it's what we hone in on to see if there is equivalency demonstrated. This is where you're demonstrating equivalency. And these sections on the application are very small, so most of the time we see an attachment with a better explanation. But here's just a brief one that I thought up. Maybe it would pass, maybe it wouldn't. Every application is reviewed on its own. So here's just, the tank was inspected by a licensed plumber and found to be in good functional condition. It's not a failed system. Tank is and will remain accessible for maintenance. So we're providing that. The deck post will be on piers that require no excavation and are installed at a depth below the tank. So no external pressure will be put on the tank by the posts, so that the tank will remain in good shape. And the tank will be protected during the installation of the posts and reconstruction of the deck, so it won't be damaged. So there won't be any, health, safety, or welfare concerns with this replacement. We're protecting the workers, we're protecting the system, and there will be functionally no changes to it, I guess. So then section 8, you're going to list any attachments that are going to be considered as a part of the petitioner's statement. So here's where you would want to include any code sections. If it's a model code section, it's going to be changed in the next year or so. If you have any test reports, research articles, expert opinions, things like that, previously approved variances to prove that you're not, setting a precedent or anything like that. And then pictures, plans, and sketches. So here's what we kind of typically get alongside sometimes some applications. So you get an inspection report proving it's not failed, pictures of the existing deck, drawings of the new deck, and informational literature from the pier manufacturer, just as an example. These might be some things that go along with it, and those would be attachments that go on the plan review in ISLA. The next section, so we're on to page 2 now, is going to be some verifications. So section 9 is a verification by owner. The petition can be submitted by someone else in ISLA, but this section needs to be signed by the owner. So we can see here, the owner of the POWTS was John and Jane Doe. They signed it. They acknowledge that they have ownership of it, and it cannot be approved without this signature. So this is something that we see as mistakes sometimes on variance applications. These are signed by the submitter instead of by the property owner, but it needs to be signed by the POWTS owner. The fire department position statement is not required for POWTS, so you can skip that section. You don't need to fill it out. You don't need a fire department position statement, but you do need a local government inspection recommendation. So for 383, you need this. It must be included, and it would be like the local zoning official. So let's just say an example here. This local zoning official read the application for variance and had no comment for recommendation. That's pretty common. Sometimes they'll have a conditional approval, so saying things like there's conditions that they want on the variance, approval or denial, and whether or not those conditions are taken into account in the actual approval depends on the application. But it needs to be signed by the local government official. It could be as a separate attachment if you have something else, but that needs to be included. This is something that we see missing on a lot of applications, variance applications. The next section is the public health life safety position statement, and this is also not required. So that's kind of nice. So now the application is all filled out, pretty easy, right? What do we do next? Well, we want to submit it via ISLA. So this is what the application selection looks like in ISLA to submit a petition for variance. So you do plan reviews, POWTS, POWTS petition for variance, plan review. That's how you get there in ISLA. What happens after we submit it into ISLA? Well, you wait to hear back. Variances are reviewed and approved in the same first in, first out format, just like plans. But you could basically have one of 3 outcomes when it comes to this. So if equivalency is adequately demonstrated and the form is correctly filled out, the petition will be approved. So there's that. If equivalency is not adequately demonstrated, or maybe the form isn't correctly filled out, there's missing signatures or details, things like that, then there'll be additional questions from the plan reviewer and submission revisions that demonstrate that equivalency. We don't want to just deny something. We want to work with you, and that's why those phone numbers and emails and things are so important, so that we can contact someone quickly, so that we're not sitting on this variance application waiting for a response. Now, what if equivalency cannot be adequately demonstrated? Well, if it cannot be adequately demonstrated, then the petition will be denied, and there is a right to appeal, and that'll be on the denial letter. We try to guide people through the process in a way that they're not submitting variances that would be denied, I guess. So there is that. So When we actually talk about equivalencies and the intent of the code, sometimes people have questions about that, like, well, how do I demonstrate an equivalency if I don't know what the intent of the code is here? And the intent of the code is not necessarily spelled out in black and white. So what I'm going to talk about here is just my thoughts on it and, what we commonly see in variance. These are not exclusive, they're just some ideas. So when we're talking about the setbacks, the horizontal setback parameters, and we're talking about the physical feature of a building, these are the concerns or the intent, I guess, of the code that I see. So we want, one, there to be safety during the construction and installation of the POWTS and the building, so it's safe to install. We want the system to be accessible for continuous maintenance, and we want to prevent, once the system is installed, et cetera, any possible damage to the system or the house after construction. So we have a lot of runoff from the building, or there's additional soil moisture from the POWTS, those horizontal setback parameters are there to prevent some of those things. The list is not exclusive here, but these are some of the things that we want to keep in mind when we're trying to demonstrate equivalencies. So for my example back, when we're filling out this hypothetical application, those piers don't require excavation. So we're not going to damage the tank. They're going to be set at a lower depth than the tank. So there's not going to be external pressure on it. There's no change to the maintenance of it, things like that. So those are the things that you would want to demonstrate with a building, that you are meeting all of these things. When it comes to a property line, part of the intent of the code is to keep the wastewater on your property. We don't want to have untreated wastewater getting onto the neighbor's property. And we want there to be continued access for maintenance and for installation. When it comes to the property line setback in the code, easements are an alternative to a variance. So sometimes we'll hear, oh, I'll get a letter from the neighbor saying that they'll allow a variance so close to the property line. Well, the neighbors can change, but what you could do is get them to grant an easement for that POWTS, and that would be a legal standing thing. Whereas a letter from the current property owner really isn't equivalent to the code. So things that we sometimes see for property lines would be like the installation of an impermeable barrier to force the wastewater down instead of to the side, things like that. I see those relatively commonly. Swimming pools, the next physical feature in our horizontal setback parameter table, is a very uncommon petition for variance, but they do come up occasionally. And so what we're kind of looking at here is the same, safety during construction and installation, accessibility for maintenance, possible damage to the system or pool after construction. So pools specifically, we're thinking about drain water. Are we going to have a lot of pool drain water regularly into the POWTS? That'll affect the POWTS. Additional soil moisture from the POWTS, if it's like an in-ground pool or something like that, is that going to affect it? Probably not. And the fact that the pools are very heavy. So if you look, there is no there's no setback to an external exterior subsurface treatment tank or holding component for a swimming pool, but it has to be accessible for maintenance. But if we put a huge pool, right on top of the tank, is that going to damage it? Maybe. So we'd want to keep that in mind. And then the POWTS is a contamination source. So the treatment component, are we getting so close to the pool that if both of them are leaking that, we would end up with E. coli in our swimming pool? Not ideal, obviously. So those are things that you would want to keep in mind with the swimming pool variance. The ordinary high water mark is, a little bit different, I guess, in that when we're petitioning to the ordinary high water mark, we're trying to protect the waters of the state, which under the public trust doctrine, belong to all of the people of the state from contamination. So there's that. So you want to keep that in mind. How are we providing an equivalent degree of treatment and dispersal and things like that when we get closer to the ordinary high water mark to protect the waters of the state from contamination? And then we also want to protect the POWTS from surface and groundwater and then erosional forces. So let's say we're petitioning to something that's in a highly erosional landscape, like a Great Lake or something like that. Is it riprapped? Are there contingencies for if the shoreline erodes, things like that? And then water service and private water mains. same things, safety during construction, accessibility for maintenance, possible damage to the system or the water line after construction. So if they're leaking, and then the POWTS is a contamination source. If the POWTS isn't, if it's very close and it's within the treatment zone, if we see leaks in both, are we gonna, have a contamination of our water service? Just as a quick reminder, building sewers and water service are in 382. So, petitions for that would not be 383. They're 382, but there are some installation techniques in 382, like sleeving pipes and things like that, that could be useful in a petition for variance to, for a 383 setback. So like a force main or something like that. So that's all that I have for variances. I don't know if folks have questions about variances. Otherwise, we are quickly approaching the 10 o'clock hour here, so you can feel free to sign in, sign out.